Few men in the American Old West balanced the roles of outlaw and lawman quite like John King Fisher. Known for his flamboyant style, deadly aim, and unpredictable sense of justice, Fisher's life was a whirlwind of gunfights, cattle raids, and political intrigue. To some, he was a ruthless killer. To others, he was a man who brought his own brand of order to a lawless land. But one thing's certain, when Fisher rode into town, people paid attention. And often, they cleared the street. If you're fascinated by the real stories behind the West's most dangerous legends, hit that subscribe button and join us as we dig deep into the life, times, and bloody legacy of John King Fisher. John King Fisher was a noted figure in Texas during the peak of the American Old West, part frontier celebrity, part self-styled enforcer of his own code. He was born in October 1853 in Collin County, north of Dallas, Texas, to Job Fisher and Lucinda Warren. Fisher had two brothers, Jasper and James. Tragedy struck early when his mother passed away while he was still a toddler, leaving his father to care for three young sons. Job later remarried a woman named Minerva, creating a blended household. Following the Civil War, like many Texans seeking new opportunities, the Fisher family relocated to Williamson County near Austin, where James was already living. Job Fisher earned his livelihood as a cattleman, operating two freight wagons, work that reflected the booming livestock and transport trade of Reconstruction-era Texas. When Minerva passed away, the family once again moved, this time to Goliad, west of Victoria. There they were joined by Job's mother, who played a central role in helping raise the children. Her presence likely provided stability during a time of constant change and upheaval. Even as a teenager, King Fisher stood out. Handsome, charismatic, and confident, he drew attention wherever he went. But that charm was paired with a restless streak and a tendency to gravitate toward adventurous, rough-edged companions. Concerned for his future, his father sent him to live with his older brother James around 1869. 2 years later, in his mid-teens, Fisher was arrested on charges related to horse theft. For a youth in Texas at the time, this was a serious offense, livestock being the lifeblood of the frontier economy. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but his age and perhaps his reputation as a first-time offender led to an early release within the same year. This brush with the law marked one of the earliest turning points in Fisher's life. In post-war Texas, where the line between respected rancher, opportunistic rustler, and folk hero could be razor thin, such an incident could either end a young man's prospects or set him on a path toward notoriety. For Fisher, it would be the latter. Cowboy and outlaw. After his early release from prison, John King Fisher turned to ranch work and began making a living as a cowboy. One of his main skills was breaking horses, a dangerous but respected trade in the Texas frontier, requiring equal parts patience, strength, and quick reflexes. The post-Civil War years were turbulent along the Texas-Mexico border. Many rural families and ranching communities faced ongoing threats from roaming bands of raiders who crossed the Rio Grande, targeting livestock, supplies, and settlements. In response, local residents often formed posses, informal armed groups, aimed at protecting their communities when formal law enforcement was unavailable or too far away to respond quickly. Fisher soon became active in these defensive efforts. His successes in helping to protect ranches and recover stolen property gave him a growing sense of confidence and a reputation as someone who could handle himself under pressure. It was during this period that he began to cultivate a distinctive public image, wearing colorful, flamboyant clothing and carrying ivory-handled revolvers, symbols that blended personal style with a frontier statement of authority. At some point, his path crossed with a group of men who engaged in cross-border raids into Mexico. Historical accounts suggest that Fisher joined them for a time, perhaps drawn by the combination of adventure, opportunity, and camaraderie such bands offered. However, disagreements over how to divide the goods from these ventures soon surfaced. Such disputes were not uncommon in loosely organized groups where trust could be fragile and leadership often shifted quickly. According to contemporary sources, Fisher emerged from this dispute as the leader of the group. Leadership in such an environment was not just about force, It also required decisiveness, resourcefulness, and the ability to command respect from men who were used to operating outside the law. By 1872, Fisher had acquired a ranch on the Rio Grande near Eagle Pass in Maverick County, right on the Mexican border. This location gave him a strategic advantage. It allowed for ranching operations while also serving as a hub for his associates. In a bold display of self-assurance, he reportedly put up a sign along the road that read, "This is King Fisher's road. Take the other one." In the culture of the Old West, such a sign was as much about reputation as it was about territory. It served as both a declaration of presence and a warning, an assertion that Fisher was a man to be reckoned with in a region where personal authority often carried as much weight as formal law. During this period, King Fisher generally avoided targeting fellow Texans. Instead, most of his activities involved moving livestock from across the Mexican border into Texas. The late 19th century was a turbulent time along the Rio Grande. Both American and Mexican outlaw groups carried out large-scale raids in each other's territories. These incidents often involved the taking of livestock, property, and goods, leading to deep resentment on both sides of the border. Many Texans felt that official authorities, whether local sheriffs or federal forces, were either unwilling or unable to respond effectively to cross-border incursions. In some cases, this perception prompted certain groups to take matters into their own hands, organizing informal bands to counter the raids. While these self-formed groups saw themselves as defending their communities, such actions sometimes mirrored the tactics of those they oppose. From the Mexican perspective, these retaliatory expeditions bred distrust and heightened tensions. Each side often viewed the other as the aggressor, fueling a cycle of raids and reprisals. This climate created additional challenges for the Texas Rangers, who were tasked with restoring stability while navigating the competing grievances of both communities. One of the Texas Ranger units, commanded by Captain Leander H. McNelly, was particularly active in confronting Mexican rebel forces, including those led by Juan Cortina, a well-known figure in the long history of Texas-Mexico border disputes. At one point, McNelly's men visited Fisher's ranch and placed him under arrest. The circumstances did not lead to a prolonged legal case. Instead, historical accounts suggest that a private understanding was reached. Fisher would cease his cross-border cattle activities in exchange for his release. Faced with continued attention from the Rangers and growing pressure to abandon questionable practices, Fisher stepped away from the trade entirely. He redirected his energy toward legitimate ranching operations, marking a significant turning point in his career. This shift reflected a broader reality of the borderlands. Many who began in the uncertain space between legality and outlawry eventually sought stability, especially when they had the resources, reputation, and land to build a respectable livelihood. Gunfighter and lawman. By the late 1870s, John King Fisher was widely regarded as a man who handled himself with remarkable quickness and confidence in tense situations. His reputation along the Texas-Mexico border had grown steadily, not only because of his ranching operations, but also due to stories that circulated about his confrontations. In 1878, one such incident reportedly took place between Fisher and a group of 4 Mexican vaqueros. Accounts vary in their details, common in Old West storytelling, but most agree that a disagreement broke out, escalating into a physical altercation. According to some versions, Fisher used a branding iron to push back the man closest to him, after which the encounter intensified when another vaquero appeared to reach for a weapon. What happened next became part of Fisher's legend. Some witnesses claimed that 2 of the men were not actively involved and had been sitting on a nearby fence during the dispute. This detail added controversy to the story and has fueled debate among historians over whether the incident was a matter of self-defense, misunderstanding, or simply the product of a volatile frontier environment where disputes could spiral quickly. Local law enforcement did arrest Fisher several times over the years for public disturbances and confrontations. At least once, he faced a formal charge of intent to kill, but that case was dismissed when no witnesses came forward, a not uncommon outcome in the Old West, where fear, loyalty, or community ties often discouraged testimony. Amid this rough and tumble period of his life, Fisher also began to build a family. On April 6, 1876, he married Sarah Vivian. The couple would go on to have 4 daughters. This new chapter offered Fisher a degree of domestic stability, even as his public life remained shaped by the tensions and unpredictability of life on the Texas frontier. With his marriage and the arrival of children, John King Fisher began moving toward a more stable way of life, focusing on legitimate work in the cattle trade. This shift marked a new chapter, one that suggested he was seeking respectability after years of living on the edge of the law. Between 1881 and 1883, Fisher entered public service, first as a deputy sheriff and later as the acting sheriff of Uvalde County, Texas. His role placed him squarely on the side of law enforcement, a position that stood in sharp contrast to the earlier chapters of his life. During this period, Fisher pursued 2 men suspected of robbing a stagecoach, brothers Tom and Jim Hanahan. His search led him to their ranch near Leakey in Real County. The encounter turned tense when the Hanahans refused to cooperate. The situation ended with Tom losing his life, while Jim chose to surrender peacefully. The stolen property from the stagecoach was recovered and returned. The event left a lasting emotional mark, particularly for the Hanahan family. In the years after Fisher's own death, Tom Hanahan's mother reportedly visited Fisher's grave annually on the anniversary of her son's passing. According to local accounts, she would light a fire above the grave and perform a ritual dance, an act that may have been driven by grief, anger, or a deeply personal sense of justice. Such customs, while unusual today, were not unheard of in 19th century frontier communities where personal loss often became entwined with public memory. Fisher's reputation as a man who had faced, and often prevailed, in dangerous confrontations followed him throughout his life. When journalist Carrie McWilliams once asked him about his notches, a term used in the Old West to count opponents defeated in armed encounters, Fisher reportedly answered with a precise figure, 37, pointedly adding that he was not counting Mexicans. This statement, while reflecting the prejudices of the era, also reveals the complex and often troubled relationships between Anglo-Texans and their Mexican neighbors in the borderlands of the 19th century. Vaudeville Theater ambush. By the early 1880s, King Fisher and Ben Thompson were among the most talked about figures in Texas. Both men had reputations for being formidable in dangerous situations, and both carried the kind of notoriety that could make them admired in some circles and feared in others. Ben Thompson, an English-born Texan, had been involved in several high-profile confrontations by 1884. One of the most notable was the 1882 incident involving Jack Harris, a popular theater owner in San Antonio. That event was ultimately ruled an act of self-defense, and Thompson's public standing in Austin remained strong. In fact, Thompson had served as the chief of police for the city of Austin, where he was regarded as highly effective and surprisingly popular for someone with such a colorful past. He eventually resigned after being cleared in the Harris case, stepping away from law enforcement, but not from the public eye. King Fisher, by contrast, had moved toward a quieter existence. While his earlier years were filled with stories of his quick reflexes and bold encounters, by 1884 he was living near Leakey, Texas, as a successful rancher. Having recently stepped down from his position as sheriff of Uvalde County, he had devoted more time to his family and to managing his cattle operations. Despite their different paths, Fisher and Thompson shared a close friendship. On March 11, 1884, Fisher traveled to San Antonio for business, where Thompson was also present. Their connection would soon place them both at the center of an event that drew widespread attention. Jack Harris, whose earlier dispute with Thompson had made headlines, was himself a central figure in San Antonio's entertainment world. Originally from Ireland, Harris immigrated to Connecticut before eventually making his way to Texas. His varied career included a stint with the San Antonio Police Department and service in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Some accounts suggest Harris may also have served under Emperor Maximilian during the Franco-Mexican War, though historians have never confirmed this claim. After returning to San Antonio in 1868, Harris rejoined the police force and soon ventured into the saloon business. In 1872, he sold his share in a partnership saloon and used the profits to open his own establishment, the Jack Harris Bar and billiard room. Later, he rebranded it as the Vaudeville Theater, which became one of San Antonio's most popular venues. The theater anchored the city's sporting district, a lively but controversial area known for its saloons, gambling halls, and entertainment venues. Jack Harris had known Ben Thompson since their time serving in the military. By 1880, their paths crossed again at the Vaudeville Theater, where Thompson spent a significant amount of time gambling. He often played alongside Harris's business partner, Joe Foster, but during that period, Thompson lost heavily. When he left the theater after one such night, observers described him as being in poor spirits. There were later reports that he made threats, though these claims were never substantiated with reliable evidence. After leaving San Antonio, Thompson returned to Austin, where he served as chief of police, while also operating the Iron Front Saloon. Not long afterward, Harris and Foster sent word to Thompson that he was no longer welcome at the Vaudeville. If Harris had delivered this message privately, the matter might have ended quietly. However, word spread that Harris was telling others, perhaps in a boastful tone, that he had banned Thompson from his establishment. This public element turned what could have been a simple disagreement into a matter of personal pride, something that carried great weight in 19th century Texas social culture. On July 11, 1882, Thompson returned to San Antonio. Theater manager Billy Sims encountered him on the street and tried to persuade him to stay away from the vaudeville. Thompson declined the advice and entered the building. Inside, he approached the bartender and asked him to pass a message to Harris and Foster that he intended to close the place down. While this phrase might sound threatening today, in the context of the time, it could simply have meant that he planned to remain there all night, outstaying his welcome, rather than literally shutting the business. After a brief conversation with his friend, jeweler Leon Rouban, Thompson left the theater and stepped back outside to socialize with acquaintances along the street. Meanwhile, upstairs, Billy Sims armed himself and warned Harris. Harris then acquired a shotgun and positioned himself behind a screen near the front entrance, waiting for Thompson's return. Accounts suggest he remained there for at least 10 minutes. Thompson eventually walked back toward the entrance of the vaudeville, but did not immediately go inside. Standing just outside, he noticed Harris with the shotgun, but initially chose not to comment. He even paused to hold the door open for two women entering the building. Only after a short wait did Thompson speak up, addressing Harris directly. Harris replied in kind, and tensions flared. Contemporary witnesses later disagreed about the exact timing of what happened next. Some claimed there was a long pause after the exchange, while others insisted that only seconds passed. What is clear is that the verbal confrontation marked the breaking point in an already simmering dispute, setting in motion the sequence of events that would become one of San Antonio's most talked about incidents of the era. After the confrontation, Jack Harris, though he had not discharged his shotgun, managed to make his way upstairs before collapsing. A doctor was called to his aid. According to some accounts, Harris remarked that Thompson had taken advantage of him and fired from the shadows. While this claim reflected Harris's perspective in the heat of the moment, the facts were more complex. Harris had been openly armed, and the area itself was lit. Thompson was positioned just outside the doorway, where the lighting was dimmer, but his location appears to have been coincidental rather than strategic. Harris's decision to visibly hold the shotgun placed him at a disadvantage in the eyes of the law. In 19th century Texas, openly displaying a weapon in a heated dispute could be interpreted as a direct threat, providing a strong basis for a legal claim of self-defense, especially when no shot had yet been fired. After the incident, Thompson returned to his room at the Menger Hotel. He remained there throughout the night, and no immediate arrest was made. The following morning, he voluntarily surrendered to Bexar County Sheriff Thomas P. McCall and San Antonio Police Chief Sheridan. The event quickly became a subject of intense public debate. Two newspapers, the San Antonio Light and the Austin Statesman, took opposing sides, publishing sharply worded editorials. One demanded justice against Thompson, while the other defended his actions. Soon, papers across Texas joined the conversation, some condemning him, others supporting him. In San Antonio, public opinion was deeply divided. Certain residents, particularly those who had been close to Harris, saw the incident as a grave wrong. Others, however, believed the city might be better off without Harris, whose role in the sporting district had made him a controversial figure. On September 6, 1882, a formal indictment was issued against Thompson. A change of venue was considered, but by that time sentiment had begun to shift in his favor, so the trial was held in San Antonio. The proceedings concluded on January 30, 1883, with Thompson's acquittal. Friends and supporters celebrated outside the courthouse, while Harris's allies were left angered and disappointed. When Thompson returned to Austin, he was greeted by a large crowd that welcomed him home in triumph, an ending that underscored how differently communities could interpret the same event in the politically charged and personality-driven world of the Old West. Ambush. On March 11, 1884, John King Fisher was in San Antonio on business when he met up with his old friend Ben Thompson, who was also in town for professional matters. Thompson's presence in San Antonio was still controversial. The 1882 death of Jack Harris had left lingering resentment among Harris's friends and allies, particularly Joe Foster, a business associate of Harris and a co-owner of the Vaudeville Variety Theater. The tension between Thompson and this group had never fully subsided. Fisher had no connection to the dispute. By all accounts, he was simply spending the day with Thompson as a friend. Yet this chance meeting would place him in the middle of a conflict he had no role in creating. That evening, Fisher and Thompson attended a performance at the Turner Hall Opera House. Later, around 10:30 p.m., they made their way to the Vaudeville Variety Theater. They were joined by Jacob Coy, a local lawman. Thompson's intention was to speak with Joe Foster. Foster now co-owned the theater with Billy Sims, another of Harris's associates. Earlier in the evening, Thompson had already spoken with Sims in a surprisingly cordial exchange, given the history between them. Still, despite moments of civility, the air was heavy with old grudges. Both Fisher and Thompson were well known as experienced and capable gunmen. Their reputations alone were enough to make most opponents think twice about confronting them directly. This may explain why, rather than meeting them in open dispute, Thompson's adversaries considered a more calculated approach. Inside the theater, Fisher and Thompson were told to go upstairs to meet with Foster. Soon, Coy and Sims joined them in a theater box. Foster, however, refused to speak with Thompson. At some point, Fisher reportedly sensed that something was wrong. Moments later, Sims and Coy stepped aside. Almost immediately afterward, gunfire erupted from another theater box. Both Thompson and Fisher were struck multiple times before they could react. The suddenness of the attack suggested planning rather than a spontaneous quarrel. Thompson collapsed to the floor. Accounts differ on the exact sequence, but it was reported that one of the men in the room approached him and fired at close range. In the confusion, Thompson managed to return fire, though he succumbed quickly to his injuries. Fisher, hit repeatedly, was able to fire at least one shot in response. Some believe this may have wounded Jacob Coy, though other versions suggest Coy's injury might have come from the attackers themselves. Coy survived but was left permanently disabled. During the chaos inside the Vaudeville Variety Theater, Joe Foster reportedly tried to draw his own firearm, but accidentally wounded himself in the leg. He was quickly taken down the street for treatment. Despite the efforts of local doctors, the injury proved severe. Amputation was attempted, but he passed away during the procedure due to significant loss of blood. A tragic end that added yet another layer to the night's grim events. Piecing together exactly what happened in the theater box that evening has always been a challenge. Most accounts came from individuals who were either aligned against Ben Thompson or were among the group involved in the attack itself. This made it difficult for historians to find truly neutral witnesses. In the immediate aftermath, the assailants claimed that Thompson and Foster had exchanged heated words, that Thompson had drawn his weapon first, and that Foster responded, leading to an exchange of gunfire. Over time, however, evidence and testimony weakened that version of events. Contemporary investigations point instead to a planned surprise attack, leaving little room for credible self-defense arguments. Public opinion was divided, but a strong outcry emerged from Austin, other Texas communities, and even within parts of San Antonio. Many considered the act dishonorable and believed it violated the Old West's unwritten codes of fair conflict. Calls for a grand jury investigation grew louder. Despite these demands, the case stalled. San Antonio's police department and the local prosecutors showed little inclination to pursue it further. Whether due to political pressure, influence from powerful figures, or a reluctance to reopen old feuds, the matter quietly faded from the legal system. King Fisher was laid to rest on his ranch, but his remains were later moved to Pioneer Cemetery in Uvalde, Texas, where they remain today. Ben Thompson's body was returned to Austin, where his funeral drew one of the largest crowds the city had ever seen. He was buried in Oakwood Cemetery, a resting place for many notable Texans of the era. John King Fisher's life was a blend of contradictions: rancher and gunman, respected community figure, and feared adversary. In an era where reputations were forged as much by courage as by the stories told about them, Fisher's name became part of Old West legend. His death, sudden and without warning, ensured that the full truth of his life would forever be wrapped in mystery. More than a century later, his legacy still sparks debate among historians and Old West enthusiasts alike. Was he truly the deadliest gunfighter of his time, or simply one of the most unforgettable? Either way, King Fisher's story reminds us that in the rugged frontier, survival often depended on a man's skill, his allies, and sometimes pure luck. If you've enjoyed exploring this fascinating chapter of Western history, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We've got more untold tales, forgotten legends, and deep dives into the real stories that shaped the American frontier, so you won't want to miss what's next.